Tell me in the comments, would you ever dare to step onto forbidden property? Don't forget to hit that subscribe button before the next story finds you.
It was just a rotting shack by an abandoned track until I heard someone inside say, "You shouldn't be here." I have this habit of scanning Google Earth when I'm bored, zooming in on places most people would scroll right past. That's how I found this shack, a tiny square building tucked into a pine grove, right beside a stretch of railway that hadn't been used in years. It didn't look like much, probably an old maintenance shed, but it was far from any road, which made it interesting. I parked on a logging road a mile out and walked in. The air was cold enough that each breath fogged. My needles muffled my footsteps, and for a while the only sound was the wind in the trees. No houses nearby, no traffic, just stillness. The shack appeared between the trees, a squat concrete cube with a rusted metal door hanging slightly open. One tiny window, cracked and fogged over. No graffiti, which surprised me. Places like this usually get tagged to death. Inside, the light was dim and smelled like damp wood and motor oil. A workbench ran along one wall, cluttered with old bolts, cracked jars, and a half-empty coffee tin filled with nails. The floor was littered with pine needles and bottle caps. I was halfway across the room when I heard it. A man's voice, low, calm. "You shouldn't be here." It came from somewhere just outside the doorway. I froze. My brain scrambled to come up with a reason. Maybe a hiker, maybe someone from the railroad company. My pulse was already pounding. I stepped back toward the door, keeping my eyes on the frame. The man's shadow didn't appear. No sound of footsteps. Just silence. I leaned out to check. No one. The clearing outside was empty. The pines stood still, not even moving in the wind. I backed up another step, and that's when I noticed something I should have seen before. On the inside of the shack's door, scratched deep into the paint, were dozens of names. All first names. Some fresh, some so worn you could barely make them out. I didn't add mine. Instead, I walked quickly back into the woods, and every time a branch cracked under my boot, I half expected another voice behind me. By the time I reached the car, my mouth was dry. I told myself it was just some guy passing through, messing with me. That's what I still tell myself. But sometimes when I can't sleep, I think about those names and wonder how they ended up on that door. We thought the orchard was abandoned until we found the underground room and heard the door slam shut above us. A couple summers ago, a friend of mine, Ethan, told me about an old orchard on the edge of town that had been sitting empty for years. His uncle used to work there, and according to him, the owners just packed up and left one season without selling the land. It was overgrown now, the kind of place you'd drive past without even noticing. We went on a Sunday afternoon, parked behind a strip of disused farm buildings, and walked in through a gap in the fence. The air smelled faintly of rotting apples, even though the trees were long past harvest. Rows of apple trees stretched in every direction, branches twisted and heavy with moss. Most of the fruit was small, dark, and half-eaten by birds. About 20 minutes in, we found the main barn. Its paint had peeled down to bare wood, and one side of the roof sagged dangerously. We stepped inside, careful where we put our feet. There were gaps in the boards big enough to swallow an ankle. It was mostly empty. A few rusted tools, some crates, a stack of old ladders. Then, Ethan spotted a square metal door in the floor, flush with the boards. A latch held it shut. We figured it was a root cellar or cold storage for the fruit. The latch gave way easily, and a breath of cold, damp air drifted up. A wooden ladder led down to a narrow concrete room, maybe 12 by 12. Metal hooks hung from the ceiling in neat rows, and along one wall were wooden shelves lined with dusty glass jars, pickles, preserves, all cloudy and discolored. It was colder down there than outside, and the smell was strong, sour and stale, but not unbearable. We looked around for a couple minutes, shining our phone lights into the corners. I was crouched near the shelves when I heard a sharp clank. The door above us had swung shut. "Ethan?" I called. He was already at the ladder, pushing up on the hatch. It didn't budge. We weren't locked in. The latch wasn't down, but something heavy was on top of it. We could hear it scrape faintly across the metal, like it was being dragged into place. We went dead quiet. No footsteps. No voices. Just that faint scrape. After a few seconds, Ethan started shoving at it harder. It finally gave, and we climbed out fast, scanning the barn. Empty. The only fresh sign was a half-rotten apple on the floor near the hatch. I swear it wasn't there before. We didn't stick around to check the other buildings. As we left, we passed a hand-painted sign nailed to a tree by the fence line. It was old. The letters faded, but you could still read it. "Stay out of the cold room." We climbed the fence for the view, but inside, it felt like someone had been waiting for us. There's this water treatment plant on the far side of town that's been shut down for years. It sits right next to the river, surrounded by 2 layers of chain-link fence topped with barbed wire. From the highway, you can see the tallest tank, pale green and streaked with rust, sticking out above the trees. It's the kind of place that makes you wonder what's inside. One night, my friend Lucas and I decided to find out. We parked behind an old warehouse and cut through the tree line until we reached the outer fence. It wasn't hard to get over. A big pine had fallen right against it, creating a perfect ramp. The inner fence was trickier, but we found a section where the barbed wire had been clipped away. Inside, it was dead quiet. The ground was covered in gravel, and our footsteps crunched loud enough that we kept glancing over our shoulders. The main building was long and low, with big industrial windows, most of them broken. Inside, the air was damp and smelled faintly of bleach and algae. Rows of empty basins stretched into the darkness, their concrete walls stained with mineral buildup. We wandered from room to room, shining our flashlights on rusted catwalks, dangling cables, and peeling warning signs. Most of them still had the safety slogans printed on them. Hard hats required, authorized personnel only. At one point, we reached a small control room overlooking the basins. A row of old metal lockers lined the far wall. I pulled one open and found a pair of rubber boots standing neatly inside, not covered in dust. "Someone's still coming here," I said, half joking. Lucas didn't laugh. We decided to check the filtration tanks before leaving. The stairwell down to them was narrow and wet, and the further we went, the colder it got. At the bottom, the tanks loomed above us, massive cylinders with metal ladders leading to hatches on top. I was about to suggest we climb one when a loud clang echoed through the room, like a wrench hitting steel. We froze, lights sweeping the shadows. The sound had come from the far end of the hall. Then we saw movement. Just the brief silhouette of a man crossing between 2 tanks. We didn't wait to see if he'd noticed us. We turned and bolted back up the stairs, nearly slipping on the wet steps. As we came out into the open air, I glanced back. There, in the doorway at the bottom of the stairs, someone stood watching us, too far to make out a face. But they didn't move, just stood there, until we climbed the fence and dropped back on to the other side. We didn't talk much on the way back to the car, and the next morning, when I drove past the plant, there was a fresh "No Trespassing" sign bolted to the fence, right where we'd gone in. The Holloway boarding house had been empty for 20 years, but the beds were still made, and the rent ledger was open on the desk. I grew up in a small town where the biggest gossip usually came from the local Facebook page, but there was one place that always got whispered about in person: the Holloway boarding house. It sat on the edge of the historic district, a long 3-story building with faded red siding and a wraparound porch that sagged in the middle. It had been a boarding house back in the 70s and 80s, catering mostly to traveling workers and college kids from the nearby campus. The story goes that one winter, without warning, everyone left. No big announcement, no public closure, the tenants just stopped coming, and the owners never reopened. Supposedly the house still had beds made and dishes in the cupboards, like everyone had just walked out one night. I'd passed it 100 times and never saw anyone on the property. So when my friend Carrie suggested we check it out, I said yes. We went in late afternoon, hoping to have enough light to get out before dark. The front door was locked, but the porch wrapped around to the back where one of the French doors stood cracked open. The air inside was cool and smelled faintly of mildew and old carpet. The lobby was small with a reception desk and a narrow staircase climbing up the right wall. Behind the desk sat a big ledger book open to a page from 2002. The names were written in neat cursive with dates penciled beside them, check-ins, check-outs. The last page just stopped. We moved into the dining room where tables were still set with mismatched plates and dusty glasses. A coffee pot sat on a sideboard, its cord wrapped around it neatly. The upstairs rooms were exactly what you'd picture from an old boarding house. Narrow beds with faded quilts, wooden dressers, small desks under the windows. Some had personal touches left behind. A pair of glasses on a nightstand, a stack of letters tied with string. One room had a suitcase sitting open on the bed, clothes neatly folded inside, tags still on them, some of them. The layer of dust told me it had been there for years. On the 3rd floor, we found a locked door at the end of the hall. The lock was old and rusted, but the wood around it had deep gouges, like someone had tried to pry it open and given up. Carrie wanted to try forcing it, but I didn't like the idea of making that much noise. We decided to check the basement instead. The basement stairs were narrow and steep, leading down into a long, low-ceilinged space divided into small storage rooms. Shelves lined the walls, holding boxes labeled with room numbers. Inside were blankets, spare lamps, and stacks of ledger books. At the far end was a door with frosted glass. The lettering on it, barely visible through the grime, read "Manager's Office." Inside, the air was colder. A big desk sat against the wall with a telephone still plugged in. A small couch faced a wall covered in framed photographs of group shots of tenants over the years. That's when we heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, coming from the stairs we'd just used. We killed our lights instantly, standing still in the dim light from the frosted glass. The footsteps reached the bottom and paused. I could hear breathing, steady, not rushed. Then the sound of a key turning in a lock. We backed toward the far wall, hearts pounding. The basement door we'd come through creaked shut. I could see a shape move past the frosted glass, a blur of motion, tall, standing just outside the office. The breathing was closer now, almost on the other side of the door. Then nothing. Just silence. After what felt like a minute, we heard the footsteps again, this time moving away, slow and steady, until they faded completely. We didn't waste time. We slipped out of the office, up the stairs, and out the back door without looking behind us. When we reached the sidewalk, Carrie swore she saw someone standing in one of the 3rd floor windows watching us leave. I didn't look. I drove past the house a week later. Their French door in the back had been boarded up, fresh wood nailed over it, like someone was making sure no one else went inside. The old mill by the canal looked empty for decades, until we saw fresh footprints on the dusty floor. I'd passed the old Holloway mill 100 times without thinking much of it. It sat just outside town, a hulking 4-story brick building with shattered windows and a faded sign you could barely read anymore. The canal beside it was just as dead, stagnant water, green with algae, broken up by the occasional log drifting by. The mill had been shut down since the 80s after a fire destroyed part of the roof. People said it was too expensive to repair, so the owners just locked it up and walked away. One Sunday afternoon, I decided to check it out with my friend Mason. We found a spot to park behind a line of overgrown shrubs near the old towpath and made our way to the rusted footbridge. The metal groaned under our weight, and the water below looked more like soup than a river. The mill door was chained shut, but one of the windows on the side had no glass left. We climbed through into a big open space that must have been the main production floor. Sunlight streamed through the broken roof, catching the dust in the air. Everything smelled faintly of burned wood and mold. Huge wooden beams crossed overhead, some blackened from the fire. Old machinery stood in the corners, their gears frozen in place, thick with rust. We walked slowly, our footsteps echoing in the emptiness. And that's when I saw them. Footprints. Clear, recent, in the layer of dust on the floor. Boots, maybe size 11 or 12. They started near the far wall and led toward the stairwell at the back. I glanced at Mason. "You see this?" He nodded. "Maybe some other explorer came through." Maybe. But the thing was, the dust was thick everywhere else. These were the only prints. We followed them to the stairwell. The wooden steps groaned under us, and somewhere above, something shifted, the faint scrape of wood on wood. The second floor was darker, the windows mostly intact but grimy. Old desks and filing cabinets were scattered around, papers yellowed and curling with age. The footprints continued, weaving between desks, heading toward the far corner. That's where we found it. A camp. A sleeping bag, a couple of plastic jugs of water, a small camping stove, and a pile of canned food. Everything neatly arranged on a tarp. We froze, listening. The air felt heavier now. Then, from above us, the creak of a floorboard. Slow. Measured. I mouthed, "Let's go." And Mason didn't argue. We moved as quietly as we could back to the stairwell. Another creak followed us closer this time. We didn't run until we hit the main floor. The sunlight spilling through the broken roof suddenly felt like the only safe place in the building. As we climbed out through the window, I glanced back. A man stood at the top of the stairs, just far enough in shadow that I couldn't make out his face. He didn't move, didn't call out, just watched as we crossed the bridge. When I looked again at the towpath, the stairwell was empty. We didn't go back, and the next time I drove past, I noticed the window we had climbed through had been covered from the inside with fresh plywood. We thought the freight yard was dead, until the rail car doors slid shut behind us. The old freight depot on the east side has been closed since before I was born. It's tucked behind a strip of half-abandoned warehouses, cut off from the main roads by rusted chain-link fences. Most people barely notice it from the highway, just a row of weathered boxcars and a leaning water tower. I'd always wanted to take a look inside, so when my friend Ryan said he'd found a way through the fence, I was in. We went just after sunset, figuring the fading light would give us enough cover without needing flashlights right away. The fence was sagging near the base of the water tower, and someone had already cut a neat gap in the wire. Inside, the yard felt even bigger than it looked from the road. Rows of freight cars sat motionless on overgrown tracks, their paint faded and flaking, numbers barely visible under the rust. We climbed into the first car we found, empty, just dust and scraps of paper blown in through the cracks. The air smelled faintly of oil and rain-soaked wood. The second car was the same. The third had old pallets stacked in a corner and a few plastic barrels, all empty. But when we reached the fourth car, Ryan stopped. The door was open just enough to slip through, and inside was different. The floor was swept clean. A cot sat against a wall with a blanket neatly folded on top. There was a plastic storage bin beside it, and a lantern on the floor, unlit but clearly modern. "This is somebody's place," Ryan whispered. I nodded. We should have left right then, but instead we stepped inside for a closer look. The bin was full of clothes, all folded, and a small battery-powered radio sat on top. That's when the door slid shut. It didn't slam, it just rolled along the track with a heavy, final-sounding clunk. We froze. The light inside was almost gone now, just a thin strip coming through the gap where the door hadn't fully closed. Footsteps crunched in the gravel outside, slow, deliberate. They stopped right by the door. Neither of us spoke. I could hear my own breathing and Ryan's, quick and shallow. The footsteps moved away after a few seconds, but we didn't trust it. Ryan nudged the door. It didn't budge, locked from the outside. We waited. I don't know how long, but it felt like forever before we heard another sound. The faint metallic clink of the lock being undone. The door slid back just a few inches, enough for us to slip out. We didn't look around. We just moved, fast, back through the fence gap and out to the street. When we reached the car, I glanced back. The fourth freight car's door was closed again, no one in sight. But the next day, when I drove past, that car wasn't there anymore. The track it sat on was empty.
The old underpass had been closed for years, but the messages on the wall were fresh. A couple of miles outside town, there's a concrete road underpass that's been shut down since a flash flood washed out part of the bridge above it. The county never fixed it, just put up barricades at both ends and left it to rot. I'd driven past it 100 times and always wondered what was under there, so one cloudy afternoon, I decided to find out. I parked on a side street and cut through a patch of weeds to the barricade. The metal "road closed" sign was sun-bleached and peppered with BB gun dents. Beyond it, the old asphalt was cracked, weeds pushing through in long, jagged lines. The underpass itself was a long tunnel of gray concrete, maybe 100 yards from end to end. The road inside sloped down, and a pool of stagnant water covered the lowest part. The air smelled faintly of mildew and something metallic. My footsteps echoed off the walls as I walked in. Faded graffiti covered both sides, tags, crude drawings, and dates from years back. I was halfway through when I noticed the newer stuff. Written in black marker, in neat block letters, "I see you." I stopped. The ink hadn't faded at all. Farther down, another one. "Turn back." I told myself it was just kids messing around, but the neat handwriting was the same on both. When I reached the water, I could see it was only a few inches deep, reflecting the dim light from the far end. The concrete walls here were darker, damp from years of runoff. Then I heard it. A faint splash. Not mine. I froze, scanning the tunnel. The sound came again, closer this time, like someone stepping slowly through shallow water. "Hello?" I called out, instantly regretting it. No answer, just another splash. I started backing toward the entrance, keeping my eyes on the water. That's when I saw movement. A figure at the far end of the tunnel, just outside the ring of light. I couldn't make out their face, just the dark outline of someone standing ankle-deep in the water, watching. I didn't wait to see if they'd move. I turned and walked fast, trying not to break into a run until I was back in the daylight. When I looked back, the tunnel was empty. A week later, I drove past again. There was fresh graffiti on the barricade. In the same block letters, "Next time, don't talk." The Marlowe Hotel had been under renovation for 15 years, but the rooms were still ready for guests. The Marlowe Hotel sits on a corner in the old downtown district, a 6-story brick building with faded green awnings and gold letters above the entrance. It opened in 1912, hosted movie stars in the 30s, and survived 2 fires before finally closing in the late 90s. Officially, it's been under renovation ever since. But everyone knows no work has been done there in years. The scaffolding is just for show. One Saturday, I was photographing old architecture in the area when I noticed a side service door propped open. No one was around. I waited a minute, then stepped inside. The first floor smelled faintly of plaster dust and stale air. The lobby still had its grand marble counter, the kind you'd lean on while checking in, but a tarp was draped over it. Chandeliers hung from the ceiling, their bulbs gone, but their crystals dulled with dust. I wandered into the dining room. Tables were still arranged in neat rows, each set with plates and water glasses, as if expecting guests. The silverware had tarnished to a dull gray, but the tablecloths looked freshly laundered. A narrow hallway led to a stairwell. I climbed to the second floor, passing doors with peeling gold room numbers. A few were open. Inside, the rooms looked ready for check-in. Beds made, towels folded, Gideon Bibles in the drawers. One even had a mint on the pillow. By the third floor, the air was noticeably cooler. The hallway lights were dead, so I moved slowly, letting my eyes adjust. At the end of the corridor was a door marked Staff Only. It wasn't locked. Inside was a small lounge with a couch, a coffee maker, and a wall of pigeonholes labeled with room numbers, the kind used for holding mail or messages. Some still had envelopes in them. That's when I heard it. A faint creak from the hallway. Then another, closer. I turned off my phone light and stood still, listening. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, and coming in my direction. I eased the door shut and held my breath. The footsteps stopped right outside. The floorboard under the threshold groaned. Then, a soft knock. I didn't answer. After a few seconds, the steps continued down the hall, fading toward the far stairwell. I waited until I couldn't hear anything before slipping out and heading for the stairs. The lobby felt different now, heavier somehow. As I passed the reception desk, I noticed the guest ledger lying open. The last entry was dated 3 days ago. It had one name written in neat cursive. My name. I didn't run, but I walked fast to the door and stepped out into the sunlight. The next time I passed the Marlowe, the side service door was boarded shut.